A single U.S. court ruling just changed how firearm rights may be interpreted across multiple states, and the people celebrating it are not just young gun owners. They're watching this case because the court did something much bigger than strike down one restriction. It challenged the way lower courts slice up the Second Amendment itself. In this video, I'm going to show you what the court actually ruled, why this loss for the government matters far beyond one age group, and how this decision could quietly shape future firearms cases across the country. Let's get into it, starting with what most people completely misunderstood about this ruling. Source. There is one specific line in this court ruling that completely changes how gun ownership laws may be interpreted in future cases, and I'll break it down at the end. Because this case was not only about who can buy a handgun, it was about whether lower courts can narrow a constitutional right before they even do the real constitutional analysis. Most people are completely missing this part of the ruling. Source: what the court actually ruled. The case is Reese v. ATF. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit reviewed a federal law that barred federally licensed gun dealers from selling handguns to adults who are 18, 19, or 20 years old. That rule came from the Federal Gun Control Act framework and had been on the books for decades. The Fifth Circuit reversed the lower court and held that those federal age-based handgun sales restrictions were inconsistent with the Second Amendment. The court also said an older Fifth Circuit case upholding the law could no longer stand after the Supreme Court's decisions in Bruin and Rahimi. Source: in simple terms, the Fifth Circuit said this: if the Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms, that protection means very little if the government can cut off access to the most common legal market for getting those arms in the first place. The court said the right to possess a handgun for lawful self-defense strongly implies a right to acquire one through normal lawful channels. And that matters because this was not framed as a total possession ban. The government argued it was only regulating sales by licensed dealers. The Fifth Circuit was not persuaded. Source: why does that matter legally? Because once a court says access to the lawful market is part of the right, the government has a harder time defending restrictions by calling them just a sales rule. This is where legal interpretation becomes very important. The ruling turns a dealer sales restriction into a real constitutional burden that must be justified under the Supreme Court's history and tradition test. So what does this mean for you? It means the ruling is not just symbolic, it may reshape how rights are enforced. Source: why this case is so important. This case matters because it sits right in the middle of the Supreme Court's post-Bruin Second Amendment battlefield. Under Bruin, once the plain text of the Second Amendment covers the conduct, the government must show that the restriction fits America's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Then, Rahimi added more guidance by saying courts should look at how and why historical analogies work, not hunt for an exact twin from the 1700s. The Fifth Circuit used that framework and concluded that the federal government had not shown a strong enough historical tradition to support this modern handgun sales ban for adults under 21. Source: and here's the deeper constitutional point. The Fifth Circuit also rejected the idea that 18 to 20-year-old adults are outside the people protected by the Second Amendment. The court leaned in part on founding-era militia history, including the 1792 Militia Act, which required many 18-year-olds to be enrolled and to arm themselves. That does not automatically answer every modern gun question, but it gave the court a powerful reason to reject the argument that this age group simply falls outside the right altogether. Source: stop. This is the part most people misunderstand. People hear young adults 1 and think this is only an age case. It's not. It's also a case about whether judges can treat buying a firearm as somehow separate from keeping and bearing one. If a court accepts that move, the government gets a huge advantage. If a court rejects that move, gun rights challengers get a much stronger footing in future cases. That is why this decision could reshape future cases quietly, not loudly. Source: and the reason this spreads across states is simple. Other courts are not all saying the same thing. The Fourth Circuit upheld the same federal restriction in McCoy v. ATF, and the Tenth Circuit upheld Colorado's under-21 firearm sales law in Rocky Mountain Gun Owners v. Polis. That split means lower courts across the country are wrestling with the same question in different ways, which is exactly the kind of conflict that can pull the Supreme Court back in. So what does this mean for you? It means this ruling could influence future firearm laws in multiple states. Source. Real impact on gun owners. Now let's bring this down to real life. Imagine a law-abiding 20-year-old living alone, working late, and wanting a handgun for home defense. Before this ruling, federal law blocked that person from walking into a licensed gun store and buying one directly. The Fifth Circuit said that kind of restriction is not a minor technical rule. It hits the practical ability to exercise a constitutional right through the normal, legal, traceable market. For everyday gun owners, that is a very big deal. Source. But here's where people need to stay careful. This ruling does not magically erase every state law, every local rule, or every form of age-based firearm regulation in America. It does not mean every young adult in every state now has identical rights at every gun counter. It means one major federal appellate court rejected the federal handgun dealer ban, and that ruling now sits in tension with other appellate decisions going the other way. That creates opportunity for gun rights challenges, but also confusion for people trying to follow the law. Source. And older gun owners should not tune out here. Because once a court recognizes that acquisition is tied to the right itself, the same logic can matter in future fights over dealer restrictions, permit systems, waiting periods, and other rules that don't ban possession outright, but still make lawful ownership harder in practice. And this is exactly how court rulings create long-term change. Not with one giant headline, with one legal principle that gets reused again and again. Source. So, if you're someone who believes constitutional rights should mean something in real daily life, not just in theory, this case matters. Because small legal details could decide whether the law sees a burden on a right or just a harmless rule in the background. So what does this mean for you? It means small legal details could have big real-world consequences. Source. Legal ripple effect. Write this down. This is where everything connects. The biggest ripple from this case is not limited to 18 to 20-year-olds. It is about how future courts classify firearm regulations at the very first step. If judges say dealer access, acquisition, or purchase is outside the Second Amendment, then challengers lose before the real history test even begins. But if judges say those things are part of the protected conduct, the government has to come forward with historical support. That is a massive difference in litigation strategy and in outcomes. Source. That is also why lawyers and judges are watching this ruling alongside other major unresolved Second Amendment disputes. According to SCOTUS blog, the Supreme Court still has major questions hanging over semi-automatic rifles, large-capacity magazines, sensitive places, non-violent felon cases, and age-based gun laws. And Congress's own legal tracking shows multiple pending Supreme Court petitions involving age restrictions, including Paris v. Lara and McCoy v. ATF. So this is not an isolated courtroom moment. It sits inside a much larger legal shift. Source. There is also a political effect. When courts split like this, lawmakers, advocacy groups, and state attorneys general all start planning around uncertainty. Some will push harder for new restrictions, others will challenge existing ones faster. Some lower courts may read Reese as a warning not to water down Bruin at step 1. Others may follow the 4th or 10th Circuit instead. That means the legal debate is still moving, and fast. Most people are completely missing this part of the ruling. The real fight is now over the method, not just the result. Source. And that is why I would not view this as the end of anything. I would view it as a signal that the post-Bruin era is still unstable, a signal that the Supreme Court may be forced to step in again, and a signal that what looks like one age-based case today may become tomorrow's framework for several different gun rights battles. So what does this mean for you? It means this is just the beginning of a much bigger legal shift. Source. Here's the key legal insight that closes the loop. The most important part of this ruling is not the outcome. It's how the court defines interpretation limits for lower courts in future firearm cases. The Fifth Circuit said, in substance, that the first question is not whether a restriction seems reasonable, modern, or convenient. The first question is whether the Second Amendment covers the conduct at all. And if buying through the normal legal market is necessary to exercise the right, a court cannot just wave that away as outside the amendment. That is the line lower courts will be fighting over. Source. In plain English, the ruling tells lower courts this: you do not get to shrink a constitutional right by redefining it before the hard analysis begins. That is why this case matters so much. Not just because one side won, but because it tells judges where interpretation stops. And once that limit is set, future cases can change in a hurry. This is where legal interpretation becomes very important, and this decision could reshape future cases quietly, not loudly. Source: do you think this ruling protects gun rights or creates more confusion? Type protect or confuse in the comments. I read every one. My next video breaks down another major US court decision that could affect constitutional rights. Make sure you don't miss it. Go back to 230. There's one legal detail most people overlook the first time.